Okay, welcome to our sixth CAHRS cast of 2021. My name is Brad Bell. I'm the William J. Conaty Professor of Strategic Human Resources in the ILR School here at Cornell. I also serve as the Academic Director of the Center for Advanced Human Resource Studies, or CAHRS. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's session. I'm joined by my colleague, Beth Flynn-Ferry, who serves as the Executive Director of CAHRS and also has over 25 years of experience working in HR during her corporate career. As we all know, the most prevalent HR operating model has been in existence for quite some time, really kind of focused around three pillars of HR business partners, shared services, as well as centers of excellence. During the COVID-19 pandemic, however, we saw that companies had to adjust how they approached their businesses, which obviously required similar adjustments in how HR operated and delivered its services. To better understand how these changes have impacted the future of the function, as well as to really kind of dig into exactly how companies have adjusted their HR operating model, Beth and I conducted a series of working groups over the course of the semester focused on this topic. Our goal today is to share some of the insights that we gained from these working groups, talk a little bit about the implications that these changes or adjustments may mean for HR capability, as well as to give some thought to what might be coming next as we start to move through and out of the pandemic. So to give you an idea of our plan for the next 45 minutes or so, we're going to start by having Beth and I share some of the insights that we gained from the working groups about the impact that 2020 has had on different aspects of the HR operating model. Again, we'll structure this around the kind of so-called three-legged stool, which is HR shared services, HR business partners, and COEs. We'll then examine the potential implications of these changes for HR capability, specifically focusing on what might be some of the new or amplified HR capabilities that these changes require, and also giving some consideration to how are companies thinking about building or developing these HR capabilities. And finally, as I said, we'll wrap up by highlighting 5 trends that we expect or at least hope to see kind of influencing the function moving forward. We would really like today's session to be interactive, so please submit your questions throughout the session. We may answer some of them as we go along, but we've also built in time at the end of today's session for some open Q&A. You can submit your questions either through the chat function here in Zoom or the Q&A function. We'll be monitoring both, and we'll field your questions that way. So we're going to start by examining the impact that 2020 has had on the HR operating model. Beth is going to share insights from 2 working groups that she did, one focused on HRBPs and another focused on shared services. And then I'll talk about some of the insights that came out of the working group that I ran, focused on centers of excellence. So with that, Beth, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, great. Yeah, we held a couple of working groups on the HRBP role, one last fall and also one this spring. And there were themes that resonated, to both of those groups, and I want to share those with you today. So, as you all know, many companies were going through HR transformation prior to the pandemic, and this included the move to more strategic HR business partner roles. However, what we found during the pandemic was the momentum here was slowed, and really the pendulum swung back towards more tactical work during the crisis, which is natural for us to expect during the crisis. Some aspects of that were more firefighting and less focused on strategic work. At least on the surface, it felt like it was firefighting and not very strategic. But I think what you'll find now is there are lots of strategic thinking and ways to do work differently that came out of kind of those firefights at the time and is influencing how we're going forward. The second thing was really about the change from HR really focusing and building data and analytics and decision making. We were really focused on building out those skills and capabilities in our organization, but really had to flip to thinking about dealing with our employees with more empathy. So kind of old-fashioned HR in that sense. But with everything that they were dealing with the safety of themselves, the safety of their families, et cetera. It was really important to think about how are our employees feeling and what should we do about that. The third thing we saw was that HRBPs, had been focusing more on driving performance through things like centralization and systemization of support. Now the focus was more on how to get work done with maximum flexibility for those employees who had to work from their homes while taking care of sick loved ones and homeschooling children. So that flexibility muscle, we flexed a little bit more. Next, HRBPs spent a lot more time on diversity, equity, and inclusion and mental health issues than we had in the past. And lastly, a number of companies mentioned that their role, HRBPs started playing a bigger role in talent acquisition. That just became kind of a point where there needed to be all hands on deck, and HRBPs became much more involved in that than is normal in their roles. And naturally, the physical location of where everyone worked changed, or most people outside of manufacturing and things like that, and caused new challenges in how HRBPs had to stay connected to employees. And lastly, the thing that we saw as well was greater silos appearing in HR than ever before. And the fact that we really need to focus on one HR, and I know we'll talk about that a little bit more in our trends later on. So that's what we saw from the HRBPs. On the HR Shared Services Working Group, there were some similar types of things going on here, similar to the HRBP kind of role transformation. Many of our companies had been centralizing and moving to HR Shared Services, or many companies called HR operation or organizations. And for those that were thinking about it or in the process of moving more services to those kinds of organizations, the pandemic really helped them because it helped them skip some steps other companies had to take. So for example, sometimes, depending on your company culture, it takes a lot of buy-in and change management to move those processes centrally. But that wasn't needed here. Self-service was necessary given so many were working remotely. Employees needed new technology and the ability to operate differently. And so this helped shortcut for some of those organizations. However, you should always be aware of what may or may not work in your culture. For instance, there were several organizations in the working group that we did that had mentioned, they had moved employee relations to a centralized organization, whether that was in shared services or a separate group. But they found that didn't work for them. They missed kind of the high touch and the personalization of some of that, the differences between the business units that they were supporting or the countries, and they reversed course and decentralized these employee relations types of groups. Another thing we found that as HR Shared Services grows, the things they manage move from those more reactive tier 1, tier 2 services to more strategic tier 3 types of services, and those start to become organization enablers. And so there really were some great advancements here as a result of 2020. And ongoing debate, I know this is a debate in companies I've worked with, that should HR be part of a global business solutions area, or should it be part of HR? And there certainly are pluses and minuses to both, and you need to think about that within the context of your organization, your culture, and how your employee experience, how you would like that employee experience to be done. And next bullet there, employee experience does continue to be paramount, and that should be the first thing you think about as you build out shared services on the delivery side. And then lastly, we had a lot of discussion in the working groups on measuring the success of HR shared services. So how do you do that? And some of the tips were through external benchmarks, so comparing yourselves to others, and this idea of employee experience and measuring through net promoter scores, which is more of a marketing tool and kind of foreign to HR, but is something that we're certainly seeing happen within the shared service arena. So those are the learnings from my 2 working groups. Brad, back to you for the COEs.
Great, thanks, Beth. And I think, as we'll see, a lot of similar themes emerged in the session that I ran around centers of excellence. It really kind of focused on two issues in this particular session. One, really kind of thinking about or looking at, how or have companies and how have companies kind of adjusted their COE structures. We've seen a lot of discussion in recent years or questions at least being asked around, does a traditional COE structure and model, does it still make sense? Is it still relevant? Do we need to adjust it somehow? As well as kind of thinking about specific practices within each of these different COEs. I think in terms of the kind of structure, I didn't see any examples of companies kind of totally revamping their COE models. What we did see, similar to some of the trends that Beth talked about in the other sessions, is really the pandemic served to accelerate as well as validate efforts to maybe modify, adjust, or add new centers of excellence. So participants were quite clear that it wasn't that the pandemic necessarily prompted these changes, but rather really moved them forward, or at least gave them greater confidence that these changes were needed. Some of the specific new centers of excellence that we heard companies adding were one around organizational development. I think this is largely being prompted by the increase in transformation happening across companies. So really kind of setting up a centralized function that is focused on things like organizational design, team effectiveness, as well as change leadership. Also saw a number of companies in different forms setting up COEs or not, sometimes not always COEs, but different structures or councils to really kind of manage programs, right? To really help to improve transparency, connection, and collaboration and communication across different COEs. So one participant, for example, noted that this was prompted by the fact that during the pandemic, 5 different versions of a mental health training program emerged within the organization. So these efforts are really designed to rationalize and consolidate these efforts to make sure that there's better collaboration across different parts of the organization. And lastly, a few organizations talked about launching an HR strategy COE, which is really, you can think of as more of an enhanced talent strategy COE, because it's in many cases largely focused on things like continuous recruitment, similar to the Beth's point around talent acquisition, really coming to the forefront in many ways recently, workforce planning, as well as return to work efforts. So again, not necessarily due to the pandemic, but the pandemic helped to move some of these new COE efforts forward. At the same time, there's a lot of discussion in the working group about companies kind of really rethinking and retooling different functional practices as prompted by the pandemic. Probably the most obvious one is around learning delivery, given that we've seen virtually all learning kind of move online during the pandemic, which has prompted companies to really kind of focus on one, how can we effectively scale virtual learning across our workforce, but also has led to deeper analysis of really when virtual makes sense, as well as when it might make sense to go back to more of a in-person or higher touch type learning delivery. And that will really require an analysis of what we're trying to train or develop and considering what mode of delivery is best suited for that. Similarly, there was discussion around internal mobility. Excuse me. We've seen a lot of organizations increase internal mobility through the pandemic, in part because the impact of the pandemic has often been uneven across different business units. Some have fared extremely well. Some have been hit quite hard, which has required organizations to move talent and be much more mobile in moving and repositioning their talent. As a result of this, a number of participants noted that leaders have become more open and accepting of internal mobility. And to capitalize on this, companies are looking at building leadership training to further facilitate mobility post-pandemic, as well as to build supporting structures, things like career management frameworks, et cetera. Lastly, workforce planning. This is an area that has really become a challenge through the pandemic, given all the volatility and uncertainty that we've seen. But companies talked about a number of innovative approaches that they've adopted to deal with some of this. One being the idea of decoupling headcount forecasting from capability forecasting. Certainly, headcount forecasts have been largely thrown out the window in many cases during the pandemic, but capabilities don't change as quickly, and therefore are more enduring and can be used for more of these planning purposes. So kind of decoupling some of these different areas that may be more or less acceptable to some of the current situations or trends that companies are experiencing. So again, these were just a few of the key takeaways, but I think the general sentiment was that while the pandemic hasn't necessarily kind of blown up the COE model, it's provided an opportunity for companies to really rethink, number one, the centers of excellence that are needed, but also the specific practices and how to deliver those practices within the different various centers. So, all these changes raise questions about, how do we make sure that HR capabilities are aligned with these kind of adjustments or modifications to the HR operating model, going forward. In early May, Beth and I conducted a working group that examined how companies are thinking about HR capabilities. And during this session, we really focused on two main questions. The first being, what are some of the new or perhaps just amplified HR capabilities that leaders need going forward? And second, what strategies are organizations adopting or thinking about as they look to develop these capabilities? So to frame this discussion, we positioned it within the CAHRS HR competency model that we developed and launched in 2018. This was developed in conjunction with our CAHRS advisory board. This particular effort was co-chaired by Kevin Cox, who is currently the CHRO at General Electric. And our goal with this effort was really to kind of look, a little bit towards the future, 5 years or so out, to think about, given changes that we're seeing in the function, what are some of the key capabilities that are going to be required for leaders in key positions? One of those being senior HRBPs, and as you'll see on the next slide, COE leaders. And here you see listed some of the key roles and responsibilities, as well as the traits and personal attributes, as well as competencies and capabilities necessary to really carry out those roles effectively. On the next slide, you see similar model for COE lead. Again, key roles and responsibilities around things like thought leadership and innovation, expert analysis, global process ownership, and again, some of the attributes and competencies needed to perform those. So what we really wanted to kind of examine in this working group was, have the changes that we've seen really kind of modified those competencies or capabilities that we'll need to focus on going forward. And I would say the overarching answer was, I don't think enough has changed in the last year to really kind of dramatically change the capabilities that we identified in that earlier effort, but it has highlighted certain capabilities that will probably become even more important in the upcoming years. And I've highlighted a few of those here. One is certainly change management, given the heightened need for ongoing support of transformation efforts within organizations. So we heard, HRBPs talking about the need for them to support their people leaders and their change efforts while also providing coaching and advisory, as well as the need for COEs to move from just kind of developing products and services to also really driving the implementation of those products within the business. At the same time, I think given all the change that we're seeing and change really becoming the new norm, there was a discussion around change management alone probably isn't enough. We also need to focus increasingly on organizational agility. So really thinking about HR leaders' role in building that capacity within their organizations, not only to support ongoing transformation, but also to support the increasing array of different kind of work models and arrangements that we're seeing, whether those are gig work or contract work or fast action project teams, really providing that muscle that organizations can flex as they look to diversify their different work models post-pandemic. The third one, data analytics, is surely one that's gotten a lot of attention in recent years. So it's been on the radar. But what we've heard through these working groups is that it will become and is becoming even more critical going forward, in part because of the need to leverage data analytics to navigate through a lot of the ambiguity and uncertainty that companies are wrestling with, particularly as it relates to talent decisions around recruiting and development and succession. We need to make sure that we're making evidence-based decisions. And the last one here, a little bit broader, but the idea being that we're seeing an increasing need for HR to engage in collaboration and partnering. What we heard repeatedly across these working groups is that HR has a lot on its plate. That's certainly always been the case, but even more so throughout the pandemic, when HR has really been at the front and center of all these efforts to navigate through disruption. And given that, HR is increasingly having to kind of look to others to partner and to take on some of these responsibilities. So we heard individuals in the working group, for example, talking about trying to upskill their people leaders in certain kind of fundamental HR practices like organization design so that they can do some of that on their own more independently, or making sure that they're partnering more across different parts of the kind of HR operating model to make sure that we're driving maximum impact and efficiencies, as well as achieving that kind of one HR that Beth alluded to earlier. Certainly, there were some other capabilities that emerged in the discussion, things like supporting people technology integration, digital transformation, global mindset, project management skills, organizational design, et cetera. But these were really the four key ones that emerged through the discussion. I found a really interesting part of this working group actually to be the kind of ensuing discussion around how are companies thinking about developing these capabilities. And much of that discussion really revolved around concerns that people have around the current state of HR development, which is being done by necessity almost exclusively online. There was some concerns, as you might expect, about just simply online fatigue, given the amount of time that people are spending online, on Zoom meetings and webinars, people attending yet another online development session. Were they really able to kind of maximize and extract maximum value from those learning experiences? Related to that, there was also concerns about the sustainability of some of these efforts. As I just talked about, we know that HR is being pulled in many different directions. There's concerns about just simply the bandwidth to engage in development. And we saw companies experimenting with a lot of different approaches to try to encourage participation, whether that was leader testimonials, experimenting with more innovative delivery mechanisms, things like gamification, as well as incentives. And some of those have had some success, but even so, there were concerns about over the long term, are we really going to be able to sustain some of these development efforts? And given this, what we're seeing a lot of companies try to do is supplement some of that self-directed online learning with more social learning, peer-to-peer learning, as well as mentoring, really to make sure that people are getting the most out of those learning experiences. Ultimately, I think there's widespread agreement that once we move beyond the pandemic and face-to-face learning becomes an option again, that we're really going to have to look at this model very closely. It's appealing in the sense that it's efficient, we can scale it globally, other things, but there are concerns about whether the online model alone is really going to lead to the types of outcomes that we're striving for. So with that, we thought we'd wrap up before we move into the Q&A. Please, again, do submit any questions that you have using the Q&A function or in the chat. We look forward to addressing some of your questions in the time we have remaining. But before doing that, we thought we'd just take a few minutes and maybe look in our crystal ball and give some thought to, what are some of the trends that we, expect or maybe hope to see shaping the function as we move through and out of the pandemic. So Beth's going to get us started here, and then I'll wrap us up.
Great. Thanks, Brad. Yeah, I'm going to take the first two. And, the first one isn't really probably a want, it's more of a need, right? How are we going to sustain the gains that have happened over the last year or so? HR has really been able to advance the agenda on things like DE&I, mental health, and working more flexibly than the function has, and these are things that the function has been pushing uphill for years. We've been talking about them, for a long time, and finally the time is here that that not only the pandemic caused us, but there's been more pull from both employees and leaders on those topics and others as well. But the biggest challenge comes now, right? Things are getting back to, normal, whatever the new normal is in your workplace. And you'll really need to figure out what's important to sustain those gains that you've already made and take them even further to support both the business and employees going forward. So some thoughts on doing just that. I've heard a lot on your companies talk about doing things like listening tours, specifically in the realm of DE&I. Last summer, I think, is when a lot of those started. But take that idea, repurpose that for different topics so that you can keep that pulse on what's going on and what's on employees' minds and what their experience is. A second way to think about that is, a lot of your companies talk about continuous improvement, especially in manufacturing and other areas. Well, really take that mindset, that continuous improvement mindset in HR, and continue to evolve support for things like mental health and flexible work. And the last thing I'd mention there is that, technology continues to advance. Make sure that your company is leveraging what's new out in the marketplace for you and for your own employees and for the HR function. The second theme that Brad and I identified is, obviously delivering HR virtually. Remote and hybrid work arrangements are here to stay. And that means that, not only are your employees and leaders working in that environment, but HR needs to operate in that environment. You will need to continue to, or HRBPs will need to continue to connect with remote employees. Technology and self-service will be more central, and COEs will need to adapt their practices and offerings to accommodate employees that are more widely distributed across different work arrangements. Remote and hybrid employees are, in many cases, no longer going to be the exception, but the norm. And this creates great opportunities, but it also creates challenges for your organizations. And so, a couple of challenges I would mention that you guys need to think about is that, companies really need to ensure that all segments of your workforce, so you've heard the home, hub, hybrid kind of differentiation, that all those segments are treated similarly when it comes to things like how they receive communication, who's talking to them, that they're included in different things, that they get job opportunities and career advancement, no matter which of those three arenas they may be in, that they're involved in task teams, that they're getting exposure and being pushed to continue to grow and learn no matter where they're working. And that can be challenging. So it's something for you to think about at your company and within your own culture. And HR really needs to ensure that there are systems in place to help leaders and employees maneuver in this new reality and make sure you have connection and a strong employee experience that will continue to support and drive your business and grow innovation. Brad, over to you.
Great, thanks, Beth. So just to pick up on the last three here, the first one around evolving HR capability, I won't dwell on because I just talked about that one a bit, but I thought it was worth reinforcing that we know that HR capabilities will continue to evolve and change, and it will be really critical to ensure that we continue to develop within the function. We tend to jokingly say we're the proverbial cobbler's children. We develop everyone else and don't focus much of that attention on ourselves. But it will be really critical as we move through and figure out, as these changes emerge, what capabilities we need to develop, that we do focus that attention internally as well as externally. I think what we heard across a lot of the different working groups was kind of implications around the employee experience, as we've talked about. We've heard that the pandemic has served to further make salient many of the silos that exist within the function. We've highlighted examples of that, the 5 different mental health programs being developed, or kind of conflict between COEs and HR business partners in roles and responsibilities. And obviously, all of this is not good news for the efforts that we've been engaging in recent years to really kind of drive and create positive employee experience. And so going forward, really thinking about, how do we drive this integration? And I think two things we need to think about. One is obviously structural in the sense of we've seen, as I talked about from the COE working group, organizations standing up program management COEs or HR councils really is this kind of structural mechanism to drive coordination, communication, transparency across different parts of the function. And I think those efforts can go a long way towards really creating this kind of one HR approach that we're striving for. At the same time, we heard a number of examples that are more process driven. For example, one company talked about having a one HR team meeting that had representatives from every function coming together regularly to share their experience during the crisis and discuss roles and responsibilities going forward. So I think both of these structural as well as process pieces can come together to really help ensure that we're all working towards that common goal of a positive employee experience. And then lastly, I think at a global level, we can think about, how do we maintain the innovation mindset that's really come out of this pandemic? I think throughout, what we've seen in this webinar today and the insights that we've gained from the various working groups is that it's really served as an opportunity to accelerate and advance change within the function. And I think that's been great, but hopefully we can look ahead and think about how can we maintain that innovation mindset in the absence, hopefully, of major disruptors like a global pandemic. And I think a couple things we can think about there are, one, how do we continue to leverage data to figure out where those opportunities for innovation and change exist and where they might be most impactful? Two, continue to run experiments and pilots. I think, we were able to do that more during the pandemic because we had to, realizing going 80% is fine. We don't need to be 100% every time before rolling something out. How can we continue that mindset going forward? Third, really think about how do we leverage cross-functional perspectives to really prompt creative solutions, bringing in those outside of the function, whether it's marketing, other areas to really help provide insights. And then finally, really listening to our employees. A lot of the best innovations might come through those channels, understanding their experiences, where their pain points are. And we've certainly seen increased efforts in that realm, particularly in the DE&I space over the past year. And hopefully those listening efforts can help drive this innovation going forward. So with that, we'd like to shift attention and use the remaining time to answer some of your questions. We've seen a few come in already. If you have one, please go ahead and submit. We have one here by Laura, kind of asking about, HR and burnout over the last 16 months. And as a result of that, are organizations reporting higher than average attrition within the function as opposed to other groups? And I would say, Laura, what I have not heard specifically companies talking about kind of seeing increased attrition in HR. What we have heard is about companies seeing increased attrition, though, in other areas. Marketing, we've heard about in tech, which has been a challenge for a number of years. So I think companies are seeing these kind of functional as well as generational pockets of attrition popping up, which is really prompting a lot of questions about, do we need to revisit our employee value proposition? Do we need to rethink kind of our rewards and benefits, remote and flexible work, et cetera? So actually, one of our major topics within CAHRS for the fall is probably going to be around talent management broadly, really thinking through a lot of these talent management issues around mobility, attrition, acquisition, because we think those are really front and center for organizations currently. There's another question.
On the point about the second half of that question, anything others are doing specifically to care for HR in these times? We did talk about that a little bit in the HR business partner groups. And it is, one role that not every company has, but I'm seeing more companies put these in now, is that kind of HR for HR person, or HR for HR responsibility on the leadership team, where you're bringing people together to really think about, what are the needs of the HR function, and to figure out, what you need to do there within your own culture and environment. So that's one thing I would put out to the group.
Thanks, Beth. Great add. Another question here, which I'll direct to you, Beth, it relates to your section on HR shared services. You mentioned the employee experience concerns, and the question is really about, specifically how are companies thinking about the employee experience relative to, HR shared services?
Yeah, I think, we didn't get into, minute detail on this in the working group, but what I would say is that, each company, again, within your business model and how your culture works, your HR teams need to figure out what kind of experience do you want your employees to have, right? What is most important in your environment that may not need to be or shouldn't be centralized and put into more of a case management or chatbot type of situation. You might need more personalized or high touch or something different there, right? And so those are the things that, as you think about moving things in, if talent acquisition is really important in your company, there might be some aspects of talent acquisition that you can put into shared services, and it would be a good experience for applicants and for your managers who are using that. But there might be certain steps of that experience that you want to maintain a little bit more personalization and kind of control of. And so I think you just need to think through your culture, what you want to deliver within, and what your employees expect from that experience. And then figure out, okay, where does it belong? How do we want to serve this up to our employees?
Great. So another question here from Pedro, which I can take an initial stab at, and Beth, you can jump in. Kind of asking if we've seen an evolution, OD, org development, org design, make it more of a science than an art. For example, leveraging software, or really kind of maybe leveraging data more to help make the process more objective. I think it's a great question, Pedro. I think in the companies that my working group on COEs that's talked specifically about standing up an OD center of excellence, I think in part it is driven by this recognition that there is kind of a science and practice behind it, right? As opposed to being just an art that anyone can do, and therefore really trying to professionalize it, as well as to put behind it more support in terms of data, et cetera. I can't speak to the specific software that companies might be leveraging in that space, but I think certainly the evolution, as indicated by some of these new COEs, is this goal to make it a more objective and integrated process within organizations. Beth, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, not detailed specific software thoughts, but certainly how organizations are structured are changing, right? And so whereas pre-pandemic, many organizations might have been focused on cost cutting, and some organizations, not all, and might be talking about spans and layers and things like that. The hierarchies are changing. The everything is not everything, but lots of companies are seeing flatter workforces. We're not talking about jobs so much as skills. And so I think that whole area of org design is going to open up and be very different. And I'm not sure that there are tools yet out there that will help you with that, but I'm sure they'll be coming. But I really think there's going to be a lot of evolution in org design going forward here as a result of what we've learned and how we're working.
Great. So have something here from Rodney. I think it's more of a statement than a question, but we're talking about kind of the shift to hybrid and virtual ways of working. HR, is really being challenged by leaders to address questions on how do we maintain or ensure productivity? How do we influence or make sure we maintain our culture? Certainly agree, Rodney. I think these are going to be key questions for HR. In fact, we did a working webinar last week where we presented out a stream of work that we did this semester around return to the office, much of it focused on these hybrid and remote working arrangements. So I would encourage anyone that's interested in that, check out that webinar. We also did some research on this last fall in CAHRS, and you can find that on our website. But I do think these are key questions, and kind of goes to Beth's point around, not just how do we deliver HR virtually, but how does HR support these kind of virtual working models, right? Because I think they are here to stay, and they will be the norm going forward. Any additional thoughts there, Beth?
No, nothing to add.
So maybe a final question here, a good wrap-up question. What elements of all of this work have been the most surprising, interesting for you here at CAHRS? So Beth, I'll put you on the spot. That'll give me a chance to think of the answer.
Yeah. I've said this a lot over the last year. It's not a direct answer, but I really feel like, HR really has come into its own, right? Has been so important during these times. And that's not surprising to those of us in HR, but I think it might have been surprising to other leaders. And we have been leaned on and have come to the table with more solutions than ever. And I just hope that, as we talked about earlier, that we really are able to take advantage of this time to continue to push the things that, again, have been an uphill push and now are more of a pull within the organizations, and to really make, lasting change. And so, while it's not surprising, I do really hope that we don't backslide to our normal modus operandi and really leverage what we've learned and continue to push our organizations forward in a lot of the areas we talked about today.
Yeah, I think, building on that, I think one of the most surprising things to me is both how much has changed, but also how much has stayed the same, not necessarily for worse necessarily, right? But, I think we launched these working groups with the kind of idea that we were going to hear companies totally, going from scratch on their HR operating models. And maybe that wasn't a realistic expectation, right? But I think what we heard was much of it hasn't changed. But what the pandemic, to Beth's point, has provided is opportunities to really rethink certain things that we do, to build capabilities in new areas, to have more of an influence and impact in the organization. So I think it's those combinations of what we've seen really evolve and change, but also some of the foundational elements have kind of remained core through the pandemic. So I think with that, we're just about at time. Thank you again for all your participation and questions during today's session. We will be posting a copy of this to our website, and we'll also send it out to everyone that registered along with a copy of the slides. So please feel free to share it with anyone else that you think might be interested in it. We're in the process of planning our event calendar for the second half of the year. So soon on our website, you'll see events, working groups and webinars for late August through the end of the year. So please visit our website regularly at cahrs.ilr.edu to see our calendar, sign up for events, and hope to see you at future CAHRS events. Thanks again.